Well, greetings, students. Good to be with you as always. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a very important lifestyle factor that is often really left out when considering the impact of lifestyle on health, and that has to do with stress. So let's begin by looking at what the Lord's Word has to say about stress, or rather our response to stressful situations. Let your gentle spirit be known to all men. The Lord is near. Be anxious for nothing, but in everything but by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, will guard your hearts and mind in Christ Jesus. Well, I hope you find comfort in those words. I know I do. While stress is a concept that we're very familiar with, it really doesn't have a practically speaking, precise definition. We can think of it really more as our response to threatening or challenging situations rather than the situation itself. And two interesting words that were coined by a fellow named Hans Slily, often considered the father of stress, that describe two faces of stress are eustress and distress. Now, eustress is that kind of positive stress. You're planning for a wedding, planning for some kind of a big party or event that you're looking forward to. There's still that kind of pressure, that stress, but it's a sort of a positive thing. And then there's distress or toxic stress, where you're really worried about, your diagnosis for some disease that you might have, or going to the dentist. How horrible is that situation going to be? Or dare I say it, an exam coming up that you kind of sense you're really not prepared for. That would be an exam. Those are examples of distress. An interesting aspect of stress that we'll touch on over and over is that our mental attitude, our disposition towards a perceived stressor, really sets the stage for how our body responds to the stressor. And this attitude develops subconsciously when we ask ourselves certain questions like, is this threat real or not? Is it significant? Is it likely to impact my well-being? And do I have the resources to handle it? So I think that the two major sources of stress would be pressure, just a demand for things to get done more quickly than we feel we have the resources or the ability to do. And then this factor of being uncontrollable, that there are circumstances that are beyond our control. Maybe we just feel we're not, intellectually capable of handling the demands of a particular class, and those lead to, a sense of a frustration, really. And then we also have situations where we have conflict, where we have, two opposite sides pulling at the same time. Am I going to study for my test because I know that's important, or am I going to go to the baseball game with my son because I know that's important as well? And that causes stress. Circumstances that could be considered stressful really vary very much from person to person, but generally they include things such as death of a loved one, divorce, ill health. This little pie chart shows stressors common to health professional students like yourself. And of course, stress over coursework is right there on top. Okay, now we're going to get a little bit technical here. Though stressors differ amongst individuals, we all respond in pretty much the same way physiologically. Again, it all starts in the mind or the brain. The hypothalamus activates two systems. One system is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. That's the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which produces the glucocorticoid hormone cortisol. The other is the sympathetic nervous system, which produces the fight or flight hormone adrenaline. And so we also have from the hypothalamus the sympathetic nervous system pathway. Both systems have in common the adrenal gland. This organ is essential for dealing with stress. In fact, animals that have their adrenals removed, adrenalectomized animals, live fine when they have no stress at all, but they die when they're stressed by a change in litter mate, temperature, or even just being restrained. And of course, as we know from practical experience, stress is not an all or none phenomenon. Rather, it's a kind of a graded response. The curve in the figure shows how performance at a task actually improves with mild stressors. So you can see as stress goes up, your performance level increases to a point. But then, as the stress continues, performance begins to degrade. This is what we call an inverted U shape. Okay, and this kind of phenomenon is very, very common. We'll talk about it in the next couple of slides. A little is beneficial and even necessary, but a lot is toxic or adverse. This diagram kind of puts it in a cute way, a little bit more understandable. We all enjoy a challenge, but we panic if the challenge gets a little bit overwhelming here. This phenomenon, in which a little bit of a stressor has an overall positive impact on health, can really be is somewhat generalizable and can be extended to other seemingly adverse factors such as radiation. You can see here that the tumor incidence actually goes down with a small amount of radiation. You know, who would have thought something like that is a phenomenon? But in fact, it is. And it can be difficult to explain, but it's there. And we'll see this concept again and again when we talk about the impact of caloric restriction, eating bitter tasting or seemingly adverse vegetables, the effect of exercise on health. It comes up over and over that maybe that's just the way the good Lord designed us, that a little bit of stress, a little bit of pushback is actually beneficial. Now this is a very interesting graph that illustrates the result of a study of British civil servants which compared their rank with cumulative mortality. Okay, so this is actually a bad thing to be going up, that's mortality. And you can see those people who were at the top, so to speak, the administrators, actually lived the longest. And look at these poor folks here who are the clerical people, actually died at a earlier age. And most of the deaths in this study were from stroke and myocardial infarction. And while this may seem counterintuitive, it turns out, in fact, that the high-ranking members, okay, the administrators and so forth here, the administrators and the professionals, actually had the lowest level of stress hormones when they were measured in a subsequent study, and presumably the lowest level of stress. And this was attributed to the fact that these folks had the most control over their lives and did not see themselves as helpless victims. Again, the way you see the problem actually is the problem. Here's another interesting study which really looks at the effect of a particular polymorphism, serotonin transporter variant, versus the percent of people diagnosed with depression. So granted, this is a separate thing. I understand that from stress, but bear with me, it's analogous to some extent. And you can see that when we have a low number of stressful events, 1, 2, 3, you really don't see much of a difference between those people who have the wild type and the polymorphic serotonin transporter. But when you get up to a higher level of stressful events, 3 or 4, there's a pretty clear dichotomy between people who have the wild type. You see people who have the wild type here. Basically, they, there's not much of an increase in the incidence of depression in those folks with a couple more stressful events in life. But folks who have the variant tend to have a sharp increase in the incidence of depression, which obviously shows that there is a link of the psychological variable to genetics. So this is a little bit of a complicated slide, but let me walk you through it. Stress can have an effect on our offspring as well as ourself. And this is not necessarily due to a change in genetics, that is the actual DNA-based sequence, but rather to setting up long-term patterns of expression in utero or shortly after birth. So this figure shows 2 rat mothers with her pups. The mother on the left was restricted from interacting with her pups, while the one on the right has access to her pups. So the one on the left here is this one, restricted from grooming her pups, and the one on the right had free access to the pups. Okay. Pups who were nurtured by the mother, that's this one here, grew up to have low cortisol levels and low anxiety. Low corticosteroid levels, low anxiety. Furthermore, now this is where it really gets interesting. The pups themselves, when they grew up, were more active in grooming their offspring. So they actually passed on this trait. Apparently, they passed it on for another generation. Whereas the pups from the mother that was not grooming her offspring also had this lack of grooming. And this is attributable to an epigenetic effect. So similar findings have been published showing the adverse effects of long-term maternal stress on the fetus. My advice, dads, don't stress out your pregnant wives if you don't want to have trouble with your grandchildren. Well, while we don't have a lot of time to talk about how to intervene in stress, now that we know a little bit about the effect of chronic stress, that it's bad for you, we have to consider how we can minimize stress in our life. This figure shows some approaches. Lately, these techniques of so-called mindfulness have come into vogue. All these approaches share a basic theme of channeling our mental and emotional energies away from the stressor and towards something more pleasant. In effect, giving our mind a chance to turn off that stress valve, shutting down that vicious cycle of worry and then being ineffective, causing more worry, causing more ineffectiveness, all attended with ever increasing levels of stress hormones. I'd like to conclude our discussion of stress with a quote from this gentleman, Viktor Frankl. Dr. Frankl was a Jewish psychologist who was imprisoned in a Nazi concentration camp during World War II. And he surmised that even though he was subject to brutal treatment and his liberty could be taken away, his internal freedom, if you will, stayed. He maintained that. And he kept that because there is this choice between what someone is doing to you or what you're experiencing and how you respond. And that is a different thing, say, from a reflex. And a lot of people respond to harsh stimuli, maybe being cut off in traffic, in a reflexive manner. They just respond negatively. But Dr. Frankl suggested that between stimulus and response, there's a space. And in that space is our power to choose. And that's really where our freedom lies. I just want to recommend to you that he wrote a book called Mankind's Search for Meaning. Wonderful book if you ever have some time and you want to read a very deep and moving story. And of course, one very important way to alleviate or avoid stress is to be sure to get enough sleep. 7 to 8 hours a night is generally good enough for most people. And this slide is just illustrating that not getting a good night's sleep can lead to a lot of things that we really would rather avoid, like weight gain and even an increased risk of heart disease. So here are Dr. Matroka's favorite ways of getting a good night's sleep. There's nothing, you notice I don't have any references here, but I think that these are all reasonable suggestions, and you can read through them on your own. All right, my friends, that's it for today. I have a couple of references here that you may want to look at. Hans Selye is the kind of father of stress science, and this is a good little article that gives you an overview of his original findings. And then we have this other fellow here, Robert Sapolsky, who you'll be hearing about or reading about in your lesson for this week. But he wrote an excellent book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. Fascinating account of his work with baboons. Just another reference that you may want to look at. Okay, my friends, best of luck with the lesson, and we'll see you in class. Take care.